Good morning. Thank you, Cathal. Good morning, everybody. Thank you to Teagasc for inviting me to just address the meeting today, which I think consists of a lot of people who are going to be involved in the business of farming and growing the farming and agri-sector. And just to say, from the Agriculture Committee's point of view, by way of some background, against the backdrop of, I suppose, government policy and I suppose natural objectives, the business of farming is going to involve expansion. So Foodwise 25 outlines the nature of how that expansion will take place, and it's very ambitious. One of the key points and components of that actually being achievable, well, there's two, I suppose, primarily that we would have actually looked at, the government and the committee, and that one is to get as many young trained professional farmers in control of the land that is to be farmed, as opposed to having to own it in the first place, that they can actually operate it. And I think the whole idea of the Agri-Taxation initiatives are to actually stimulate that. And the other components of that are the establishment of the mobility office, which I think runs a very useful weekly information update, and almost like an advertising campaign, but it's an awareness thing that's run weekly in the Farmers Journal. So that's hugely important. But mindful of that, all of that is very fine. But there's a head-on collision, as we identified it in the committee, between those objectives and those aims, which are primarily built on developing a sustainable rural-based economy, quite apart from the urban-based economy, which is to the benefit of the country's greater benefit. But against all of that is the train that's coming down the other track, or the same track, about climate change obligations, greenhouse gases and sustainability, which has become the buzzword for so many. So with that in mind, almost 2 years ago now, the committee decided to do a report on land use, maximising its potential, to try and correlate a lot of information that was being gathered by Teagasc and the EPA and UCD and many others, to actually make the case for Ireland's position as a leader in food production in a sustainable manner. So that's what we tried to tie together. So I've just read the programme. I do touch in a couple of slides on agri-taxation, but I know there are others who are probably going to go into it in more detail, but it's just those three aspects of what we've done, our work, I think tie in together, and it's important that we try to outline them in as a unit. There are many other things that have been going on as well. One would have been a report that we conducted on just equity in the food chain. In other words, that everybody gets a fair return on their effort, which has become somewhat skewed, and it's recognised at European level that has been the case, and it needs to be dealt with at European level. But nonetheless, it needs to be identified here as being a problem. This is Tuesday. I presented the awards in Diageo and Guinness's to the malt barley growers of the year, and I think it's very important that when you look at an industry like the drinks industry and the iconic brands, that without top quality production of the raw material, that brand doesn't have such a strong story to tell. So it's very important that the people who actually produce that food, that raw material, are actually rewarded for doing so. And we look at a generation. I have sons in their 20s now in agriculture forestry, and they would be interested in that farming lifestyle or whatever, but only if it delivers them a lifestyle comparable to what others can get in other fields. So that's, I think, important. The days when you don't count your hours as time, your time as being part of what you expend, and that you don't get rewarded for it, it's only my own time, that day will no longer survive into the next generations. So anyway, I've a few slides. I think I have 15 minutes, so I'll try and get finished before that if possible. Land use, I've outlined the three areas. It works. Maximising its potential and the methods of sustainable land use, the Carbon Navigator, Smart Farming Programme and Better Farm Programmes are all aimed at actually being able to quantify the amount of emissions or the efficiency of the food production and monitor it and be able to put it actually into some sort of calculation that can actually be used to say, yes, we do produce food. The food that's been, the production system on these farms are actually done in a very efficient manner. Certification to sustainability programs such as Origin Green. Origin Green is a magnificent label. It's captured the imagination, but behind it has to be some form of certification that actually says, and the likes of the Navigator actually can actually be, what you use to actually make that point and give that certification. Sustainable intensification, which has become a buzzword of agriculture where appropriate, and certainly an interesting one. I have a son who's working in England who's actually talking about doing some further studies on this apart from anybody else, and he gets quite passionate about it, that it is actually something that we have to look at, but people look at intensification and they look at sustainable and they don't see them as being mutually compatible, but they actually are if it's done right. Land sharing and land sparing. Land sharing it has a couple of dimensions to it. Maybe it's important to explain. One is that if we have high output potential land, and we have other land which isn't quite so productive but has other benefits, be it from carbon sequestration or other, that those lands should be shared. And I know at the European Commission level they're looking at this insofar as that, say for greening, or areas, the ecological focus areas, that maybe there seems to be a recognition across member states in Europe that this is something that should be looked at, and that's the point, that's the context of land sharing. Increased deforestation levels make sense, but then some people would say, well, if we're going to achieve the Food-Wise 2025 targets, you can't do that and increase afforestation. I think if you look at optimum use of land, there's plenty of land for both. There's land that's suitable for afforestation. There's land that's suitable for more and better use as grass, but there's land that's being used as grass that's not, or grazing, maybe not even grass as we call it, but it's being used as forage, but it's not actually being used to its best advantage. As long as that land can then be used as part of the calculation for the total output of land, of carbon for the production of food. A change of suitable land use to short-term rotation biofuel, bioenergy production. Again, it's part of a rotation, and maybe it's dedication of some land to it, but it's to use second crop as a benefit, or a rotational crop as a benefit to the agronomics of the land, to improve the land use anyway, and use that as part of the calculation for what we do produce. So land use in its total context includes the production of bioenergy, biofuel, which should mitigate the increased output, which will inevitably happen if we increase along the Food-Wise 2025 targets. This next one makes it's a sort of a no-brainer. Use best available technology and improvement in breed genetics across as many farms as possible. But to make that happen, I think we would have identified very, very, very strongly greater knowledge sharing, maximising use of farmer discussion groups, demonstration farms and regional seminars as the most efficient way of doing that. So you can use you can have the best available technology, but it's no good unless you can get it down onto the ground. And I know Teagasc for quite a while have actually probably, especially when there was recruitment restraints, trying to define how the best way of actually getting transfer of knowledge onto the ground and into practice. So and I think there would be general acceptance, properly mentored mentoring demonstration farms and seminars are actually probably the most efficient way of doing it. And to make that happen, provide upskilling for agricultural and environmental advisors so that farmers are receiving the best available knowledge in the most user-friendly fashion. And farmers to work towards using best practice farming methods. Again, I suppose young, trained professionals are your best chance of achieving that objective. Now, I'll just run through, I know the Agri-Taxation is to be covered by people more professional than me, but this was, again, I suppose, over the course of the last 12, 18 months, a recognition that Agri-Taxation and the taxation regime in place for agriculture and farmers and self-employed didn't reflect the nature of how farming was going to progress if we were going to get young people. Against the backdrop of having more people, as many farmers over 80 as under 35, something had to be done, and something had to be fairly drastically done. And I know the guidelines, which the document which called guidelines for long-term leasing, land leasing, which is very important that this is actually is fed into the whole information cycle, knowledge transfer. So the objective was to increase the mobility and productive use of land, assist succession, complement wider agricultural policies and schemes such as supporting investment to enhance competitiveness, including new entrant, young trained farmers, which a lot of the measures are actually skewed in favour of. I might say that there's a danger in some of those measures, and there always is, and I think that this is where long-term people need to look long-term, insofar as that a young farmer is seen as somebody to a prospective leaser with a bigger pot of money than somebody who's over 40, and that it becomes tempting to actually just see if I can get more of that money. But that actually is something very hard to prevent. But in the long-term interest, I don't think it's in anybody's interest that be the attitude. Environmental sustainability, including improvement of farm efficiency, knowledge transfer again, alternative farming models such as farm partnerships, which are a big part of the effort, and responses to increasing income volatility. We see that across the various commodities. I suppose cereals and dairy in particular this year. We actually did a report managing volatility in the dairy sector, which I won't say predicted, but was trying to see how that could be best dealt with. And I think that the phrase "better before bigger" is actually very apt here, so that people actually do what they're doing well before they actually get bigger. And there's a lot of other things, of course, have to happen, such as a collaborative approach. As I said in the opening, if Guinness want good barley or Boort Malt want good barley, they have to make sure that their growers are actually able to stay in business. So that's pretty basic analysis of it. Family transfer partnerships, and this is something back 30 years ago when I was trying to develop a partnership or a leasing with my father. Because he was a blood relative, he couldn't claim any tax reliefs, or he couldn't get any income tax free, which was, even though he was getting paid before I was, but it was because it was father to son, or if it had been stranger to stranger or cousin to cousin even, it would have actually worked. So I think that needed to be recognised, because they're the most popular actually still method of partnership. Appropriate profit sharing agreement, there are models around the world that actually where these work. Provision for transfer to family farm for the younger farmer at the end of a specified period under 10 years, and a tax credit of up to a maximum of 5,000 per annum for 5 years. This is to enable a gradual transfer of control, and also facilitate knowledge transfer from one generation to another. There's a point there that has come up, and that is civil partnership, property rights legislation, and a hesitancy at times for the parents to pass on to the next generation until they're reasonably sure that the nuptials are secure in the next generation. And so giving giving control and management is very important without having necessarily to have to give ownership. And I think the 10-year trial period is probably as as safe as you'll get, though there's nothing certain in this world. So the trends, existing measures retained and enhanced to assist succession planning, support investment and improve land mobility. 25% general stock relief on income tax. Higher proportion of the department survey respondents are engaged in long-term leasing than Conacre 11-month, which is the short-term arrangement. 34% on a long-term basis versus 28% in a Conacre basis. That's a significant shift, but it's still too high on Conacre. It is no way for any person trying to plan a future career in the business of farming to be depending on 11-month Conacre. And it's not really in the best interest of the landowner either if they become aware of the tax incentives for going down the long-term route. There's a significant shift to long-term leasing, which is really 2015 has been the first full year. So I think that's positive. And I think it's to the credit of the people involved in making it aware. And Teagasc has a key role. The likes of the Land Mobility Office has a key role in this. And I think people who are advising and doing both the accountancy and legal advice for their clients, many of whom would be represented in this room, actually have a big role in that. And it's knowledge, imparting that knowledge onto people, making them aware of these are the options. Because by its nature, 11-month Conacre leasing, renting is volatile. Some years it can be great, depending on which side you're on. Some years it can be terrible. It's very, very difficult for it to be good for both because it's insecure. So I think it's important that the other options are fully made aware to the landowners and people who are trying to get into farming. Almost 2/3 indicated they would like to increase the duration of their leases. I think that's probably very encouraging that it is that high. Hopefully it can be that they'll turn their wish into a reality. I think that's the key objective. The other ones are removal of the forestry income for the high earners restriction for active foresters. On that one, we were looking for the Minister to spread it over 5 years. And he just decided that'd be too complicated, so we got rid of it, because the 80,000 limit was actually a one-off clearfell 80,000, which in reasonable sized plantations at clearfall wouldn't be that massive of an area, and it was leading to difficulties with people having to manage their clearfall on an annual basis and unable to plan their replanting, which would be part of their obligations. So the removal of that restriction is to encourage a more normal way of managing forestry as it matures and for replanting. I mentioned 25% general stock relief, 100% stock relief on income tax for certain young trained farmers, 50% tax relief on income tax for registered farm partnerships, and stamp duty exemption on transfers of land to young trained farmers, and agricultural relief from capital acquisition tax is also retained. So some of those are already in existence, and others are enhanced measures to further add incentives. Just on food wise, those are the targets. I think everybody here in this room is probably aware of them. 85% increase in exports, 65% in primary production to the value of 10 billion, 70% increase in sector's value. That's value added really to the economy over 13 billion. And that's all very fine, but I go back to the point that I think the primary producer has to feel that if the value added is there and it's going to be kept within the state, that they need to see that they're getting their fair share of it. So partnership is probably a word that should be included there. The creation of 23,000 additional jobs all along the food chain, from producer level to high-end value product development, is the amount of people that can actually be extra people that can be employed in it. So there are 5 themes: sustainability, human capital, competitiveness, market developments and innovation, all of which I suppose makes sense when you see them written up there. Global demand for food to increase, population set to increase. We've seen all those figures. Emerging middle class in Asia and Africa over the next 20 years seeking higher quality food. And I think quality and traceability are the keys to that. And we have, sometimes to people's annoyance, we have a very highly scrutinised traceability regime in place that stands up, and it stands up when you see the likes of horse meat or pork dioxin or anything else. When you see problems arise, how quickly they can be nipped in the bud and not have a major impact on our markets. Investment in product development and innovation driven by market and consumer demands. We've been doing this for years. If you go back to the likes of Armour Salmon and the Sugar Company on how to develop and sugar products and many, many more, it's not something that's reinventing a wheel, but it's something that we have to be aware of. There is a full chapter in Foodwise 2025 dedicated to sustainability. Environmental protection, equality, equally important as economic competitiveness, because it will form part of it. I think what we maybe need to bear in mind that actually, whatever way it'll be calculated, greenhouse gas, carbon emissions will become a currency of sorts. So they'll have to be factored in. So from the point of view of production, unless we can actually make the case for it, we face fines. And because we're not meeting them, and significant fines. So I think it's important that never is not part of the whole Foodwise 2025 objectives. To deny it, to ignore it, is to bury your head in the sand. And the environmental analysis report drafted by the consultant is currently being reviewed by the department. So, as I said at the outset, next Monday the climate change summit starts in Paris, and I think between the Department of the Environment, Transport, Agriculture, ministers and officials, there will be, from that till Christmas and maybe after Christmas, serious negotiations to be done. And it's critical time. I know a lot of other things going on in the world here and abroad, but it's a critical time from Ireland's agriculture's future prospects point of view. That's that. Thank you.